Hello, everybody. This is Ray Samuels for Toronto Business Journal. We have an amazing show today. We're going to be talking about the opioid crisis. This is especially important during the federal election campaign that we're having now, which an issue which is, for many people, is not being talked about enough, and even before the election. So we want to welcome two amazing guests today, Natasha Touesnard and Mr. Dustin Klaudt. So take it away, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth from Toronto Business Journal, and our two amazing guests today is Natasha Touesnard and Dustin Klaudt. And let me introduce you to them for a little bit. Our first guest is the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. Prior to this role, she was the site coordinator and lead case manager at Open Door Clinic, a family practice and opioid agonist treatment clinic located in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. She was among several local people who used drugs who formed the first drug user group in Atlantic provinces, also known as the HANDUP, or the Halifax Area Network Drug Using People. And she held the role project coordinator for a number of years. She holds several volunteer positions where she is able to share her expertise and advocate for the health and human rights of people who use drugs. Most notably, she was a Canadian delegate at the United Nations 62nd Session Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 2019. She lives by the guiding principle of nothing about us without us, and is a strong proponent of harm reduction and advocate for the respect and holds commitment to people who use illegal drugs who face insurmountable challenges due to drug prohibition-based laws and policies. So that is our Natasha Touesnard today. Welcome to the show, Ms. Touesnard.
Thank you.
And our next guest is a Vancouver-based lawyer practicing litigation, dispute resolution, legal and law reform advocacy across the areas of administrative, commercial, constitutional, employment, environmental, states, human rights, and international law. He has appeared before courts in British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Supreme Court of Canada, as well as several administrative tribunals. In his spare time, he also co-chairs the Canadian Bar Association BC Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Community, and co-coaches a moot team at Allard School of Law at UBC on equality and other human rights. Let us all give a warm welcome to Dustin Klaudt.
Thank you. Awesome. So we're definitely anxious to hear about your thoughts on, what's been going on with this opioid crisis in Canada and how we can move forward based upon that fabulous interview, which I mentioned I saw, which was a great insight on how we need to move forward as far as the opioid crisis. So what thoughts would you have, either Ms. Touesnard or Mr. Klaudt, on how we can sort of, or what's been going on in Canada, and how we can sort of change things and turn around the corner in terms of this terrible tragedy that we're having to experience, where 17 Canadians in 2020 were dying from sort of opioid sort of addiction, and all this, the ongoing human tragedy, because it seems to me that we're not sufficiently trying to deal with this issue. We have all sorts of resources which are being diverted into the sort of the pandemic, and now we have billions of dollars being committed to vaccine passports. Yet there's still a lack of resources in terms of dealing with this issue, in terms of from a legal standpoint, in terms of trying to have a legal context where we can move forward away from this constant problem, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere soon in terms of dealing with the tragedy. So any thoughts that you might have, Ms. Touesnard and Mr. Klaudt, and how we can redress this based upon, I guess, the two essential points of decriminalizing and the safe supply for everybody, and to get away from this criminal context, which is persecuting people and not dealing with the sort of the issues of a social context where we as Canadians are not put in any sort of judgmental context, because it seems that the to me that, people are being, are pigeonholed, and this problem is just being perpetuated.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I guess I would jump in with saying that a lot of times people think about substance use or drug use in general as a certain demographic of individuals, but there's much evidence to support that people who use drugs, there's all over the world without issue, without a dependency, without any, harm to themselves or their family. So knowing that, and there's lots of evidence to suggest that the majority of people who use substances do not have a substance use issue, first of all. Second to that, that doesn't mean that they're precluded from, accessing poisonous drugs and being at imminent risk for death, right? So substance use crosses all socio-demographics. So I guess I just wanted to start that context because I think a lot of people, when they think about substance use and they think about overdoses and they think about people dying, they think of depictions that have been put on the media, people's hearts being pumped on the ground. And that is just not the average. It's a travesty that that's happening. But in a whole, there's all sorts of drug users in our society. And so we just see that the worst impact on the vulnerable individuals and marginalized and disenfranchised individuals in our society. And predominantly, it affects, Indigenous and Black folks and people of color through criminalization much harsher than it would a white individual. And so I guess I just wanted to start with that. But second to that, there's been very little, there's been movement over several years to open up safe consumption sites and, access to naloxone and all of these other great initiatives that are happening. But I often say that naloxone is a worthy tool in our society, but all it does is bring people back from death, and then we have no options for them to move on to. And so I think that those are very important issues, that putting more money into naloxone, put more money into criminalization of people who use drugs is going to do nothing to stop people from using drugs. Drugs have been around since the beginning of time. And so I think we have to start talking about substance use in a different way, not a negative way, because people use substances for benefit. They don't go into using a substance because they feel it's going to cause harm to them. But with an unregulated market, that's what they are exposed to. And then further to that, several years ago, the College of Surgeons and Physicians and others had started to clamp down on opioid prescribing. And that was at the same time that fentanyl was just starting to come into the market. And it's sort of like the balloon effect. So if you close one end of the balloon, the other one, explodes, or vice versa, right? So if you take away a prescribed model, and then you all of a sudden have forced individuals into the illegal market that they've never had to access before. And so for all of these factors, people are dying at home alone, a large majority of them, because of these new policies, regulations, not wanting to out themselves, not wanting to be red flagged as somebody who uses drugs. And so the criminalization of people who use drugs has put such great fear in people that no matter where they're at on a spectrum of their drug use, whether it just be made once in a while or full dependency, are very hesitant to even reach out for services because of what it could do to their livelihood. One, they could lose their employment. They could be barred from housing, as well as be stigmatized and discriminated within their employment place, if not lose their job. So there's all kinds of facets to this beyond just, I call it the overdose crisis. It's not really an opioid crisis anymore because there is so many contaminants in the unregulated drug supply now that, we're seeing more and more benzodiazepines in them, as well as fentanyl and carfentanil. And so, the longer we keep this prohibitive, drug policy moving forward, the more harm that we're doing to individuals in our society, because it just blocks them from even having a conversation about their substance use openly. And then I'll kick it over to Dustin if he'd like to add on to that.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Ray and Ruth, for having me on your show. I agree with what Natasha said. To your point about this ongoing election and the context in which we see a lot of attention being placed on the dealing with one pandemic and arguably not another pandemic or epidemic in Canada, the overdose crisis. I mean, it is somewhat frustrating to see that there hasn't been more focus in this campaign. I watched the English language debates a few days ago, and there was all of maybe 3 minutes of questioning, and not even to the Liberal and Conservative leaders, only to the two parties that had already supported decriminalization to some extent in their platform. And that's all you've really been hearing. There was a little bit of media, but it seems that the major parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, are kind of avoiding the discussion about certain public health measures that have been noted by many public health experts, and those being, decriminalization, which our provincial health officer, folks are very familiar with, Dr. Bonnie Henry, from the context of COVID now, had called several years ago for decriminalization as a policy solution in British Columbia, and also safe supply, which many others are calling on. So we see within this context, politicians listening to the public health authorities when it comes to COVID-19. However, frustratingly, when it comes to the overdose epidemic, they're not taking all those further steps that could be taken to prevent this very preventable loss of life in many circumstances. And, they are these two key pillar concepts, but they also sort of feed into one another in that you need some form of decriminalization in which a safe supply can operate without having folks decriminalized and actual regulation stepping in to control the contamination that we're seeing with fentanyl, and as Natasha noted, with other adulterants like benzodiazepines. And it's not even just that the fentanyl is in opioids now. The fentanyl has migrated into the stimulant, the cocaine and meth supply. So we're seeing, a greater variety of drug users perishing from these toxic drugs. And you need some form of decriminalization. And we see with various other policy solutions that have come about throughout the years. Folks might recall way back in the day the case of Insight, and it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, Canada's first supervised consumption site. A supervised consumption site is predicated on a specific area having decriminalization for the purposes of harm reduction, and we've seen those expand throughout most of Canada. In the major centres now have, Toronto has many supervised consumption sites now, even though they started in Vancouver, my hometown. But we also see, several other forms, decriminalizing the use of naloxone and making it more widely accessible to reverse overdoses. We're now seeing folks calling for more. The city of Vancouver has formally requested a citywide exemption from, simple possession charges. We're talking about, the criminalization of folks who just possess and use drugs, not necessarily some of the other elements that are criminalized, like the import and export, or the production or trafficking. Although Kaput, in the lawsuit that was recently launched 2 weeks ago, is asking for decriminalization of some forms of trafficking, because some folks do split and share their drugs, or they do sell their drugs because they know that it's a safe supply, whereas other folks might then go to other sources and perish. Out of necessity, they sell that safe supply, and that's a circumstance that Kaput and the other plaintiffs that were involved in its case think should also be decriminalized to help reduce some of these deaths. So we're seeing this lack of generally political will at the federal level and at some provincial levels, particularly. There's more will in my home province of British Columbia than we see elsewhere in the country, like with your provincial government in Ontario or Natasha's provincial government in Nova Scotia. But it's clearly not doing enough to stop this devastating human toll. Whereas in 2016, when widespread fentanyl adulteration of the opioid supply and other drug supply was first being observed on a wide scale, from today, by our calculations, it's about 24,000 Canadians that have perished in that period of time. That's a staggering number. I mean, I think COVID deaths are probably now slightly above that figure in the last 2 years. However, this opioid epidemic in the last 4 years is a crisis of similar scale, and we've not seen we've seen several calls and many folks calling for policy reforms across the country. In British Columbia, our premier, our mayor of Vancouver, have called for decriminalization of simple possession. Several political parties at the national level, the NDP and the Greens, to some have called for some variety of decriminalization. The Liberal membership several years ago at their party convention called for decriminalization. These calls are building, but government isn't responding at the highest levels, despite the toll of this overdose epidemic being, substantial, in the same way that I don't want to in any way diminish that COVID is a serious concern and that we should follow, public health authorities' recommendations. And if they recommend that a vaccine passport or vaccine mandates are preferred, then, that should be followed. But at the same time, they should be listened to across the board when it comes to their public health recommendations. And we're not seeing that happening when it comes to this parallel shadow epidemic or pandemic that we're seeing in Canada.
Yeah, I saw the statistic that the opioid deaths between January 2016 and September 2020 were about 20,000 in Canada, which is comparable to COVID deaths. One of the questions I have about safe injection sites is that when somebody goes to a safe injection site, is the injection site ensuring that they have a safe supply of what they're taking, or are they just allowing them to take whatever?
Yeah, no, safe consumption has been set up so that individuals can bring drugs that they've sourced out on the street or illegal drugs in there to use. And they're not offering any type of safe supply within there now.
So they could be coming to an environment where they're taking in potentially adulterated drugs, which are going to be toxic, and so they're being protected from, I guess, immediate legal repercussions, but not their public health.
Well, yes, and some of them do offer drug testing, but I mean, it's still not a regulated substance because people who use drugs, I'll use Nova Scotia as an example. Here, predominantly, people used hydromorphone, which is a prescribed drug, and it was, sold amongst individuals within here. And so then when there was the clampdown again of prescribing on doctors, that was removed. And so now we're seeing fentanyl move in, and so now they have no other choice but to bring those substances to the safe consumption site to use, right? Whereas before, they may have been able to acquire a drug of known quantity, quality, potency, and that is not, that's safe supply because the individual who uses drugs knows how to use it. And so even if they used it there or in their own home, they would be able to use that drug safely, right?
So what do you think of the report, draft report by the Canadian Drugs and Substance Strategy, which I believe recommended the decriminalization or potentially legalization of all drugs to enable more of an approach that we have with cannabis, so that all drugs that government could step in, make sure that everybody was getting access to a safe supply, and that we'd be able to stop all these deaths. I believe that was a report from Carol Hopkins, Dr. Kwame McKenzie, and Mike Sear, and I believe Portugal did something similar where they just decriminalized all drugs. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that? That if we just simply decriminalize all drugs and didn't sort of say that, well, we're going to have one thing for people who have cannabis, but we're going to start targeting, the LSD users and cocaine users. If we just simply had across the board, would we in fact be able to have stop these deaths? And because I believe Portugal tried a similar experiment. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but they tried a similar experiment and their deaths went substantively down. So do you have any thoughts on that sort of draft report and whether they're right on the train that we need to be on?
Well, yeah, ironic enough, I used to be one of the co-chairs on that. So I don't speak for the task force today while I'm here, but I was for a period of time one of the task force members. So I will just give my opinion to the report.
Yeah.
And so I think there was very bold recommendations made in there that I firmly agree with. The wanting regulation, I think that's where we need to go. I think we need to move into a legalized system. People, we can't just keep ignoring that or putting Band-Aids on a broken system that isn't working. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of the recommendations there's many great people on that task force that did amazing work and really pushed the boundaries to get this report out. And so, yeah, I'm very proud of that. I would prefix that with, I think there needs to be broader consultation with people who use drugs, no matter, not just specific to the task force, but in any model of decriminalization, because oftentimes, and we've seen this with Vancouver, they make, arbitrary things. They think they set thresholds at certain points that are going to meet the needs, not recognizing that different people have different tolerances. May have been a long time user. And so I think the point of me bringing the thresholds up is that if people who use drugs are not the main stakeholders there, then again, we're just going to develop a decriminalization that still criminalizes people. Because in fact, we would still be buying illegal source drugs and not know the quantity. And that's why people are dying. They're dying because they don't know what's in the drugs, right? And so unless you have a regulated market to buy from that is legalized, and you know the exact, like on a prescription bottle, you know everything that's in your drug, that you will take it, and then that won't harm you. And so for me, the whole not involving people who use drugs in all of these conversations, because substance users are experts in using substances, and they have lots of we have lots of expertise in helping people figure out what is realistic for people who use drugs. But oftentimes we've been cut into those conversations. And so I would hope moving forward that any decriminalization model goes forward, and that's why our suit has come forward, and it's based in the voices of people who use drugs, because oftentimes we're left out of those conversations by well-intended people that think they're making great policies. I'm sure they mean no harm, but they work within a system that still sees the criminal justice system sitting at the same table with us when we're talking about not criminalizing us, and that's an issue. And sorry, I probably rambled on and went off topic, but I'll kick it off to Dustin.
Thanks, Natasha. For some added context to that, the task force was commissioned by Health Canada as a group of experts from across various disciplines, making these recommendations after months-long consultation with various folks. And they came to the conclusion that there should be a decriminalization of all simple possession. They didn't speak about any form of decriminalization of trafficking or any of the other offenses. And that is a position that is consistent with what Kapud, Natasha's organization, and the 4 individuals who joined with them have taken in the lawsuit against the Government of Canada. Folks who are interested can learn more at drugdecrimcanada.com. There's a lot of information, including on Portugal and how the Portuguese model did work. And in Portugal, there was, a decriminalization across the spectrum. It wasn't just, some folks have suggested, opioids is where most of the toxicity is in. Let's just decriminalize opioids, okay, and leave the other criminal prohibitions. Well, I think Kapud and the plaintiffs in the lawsuit's view is that's not going to work, and it's backed by public health experts, because the stigma from drug use that is preventing folks from, going and seeking harm reduction is generalized to all drugs. And most folks won't understand if you just decriminalize opioids or one drug that is deemed to be most problematic. They won't necessarily even know what is the full composition of their drugs, because they go and they think they get something, but they get something altogether different. And then if that other element of the drug is still criminalized, they could still face consequences, and there's doubt in their minds. And should I go to a supervised consumption site? Should I seek out other forms of harm reduction, like use in the presence of a friend, tell someone who might be able to administer naloxone? Without that clear-cut statement that all drugs should be decriminalized for simple possession, you're not going to have this added benefit of folks seeking treatment, of folks seeking harm reduction to its maximum potential. And there's some questions. Portugal is undoubtedly the best example that we have in terms of a broad scale decriminalization of the possession of drugs, simple possession. However, some critics have also noted that the Portuguese model wasn't ideally rolled out because there was, certain criminal penalties like imprisonment were reduced. However, there were certain mandatory, treatment or administrative steps that had to be taken that were backed by fines that might have also mitigated from the maximum potential of decriminalizing. So folks are saying that we should have a made in Canada sort of solution that does look to Portugal and what worked there and what didn't work there, because it did work. No doubt drug deaths are down, related harms, HIV rates from intravenous drug use went down as well. I think overall drug use statistics show a decline as well. But some of the experts say that it wasn't a maximization of the potential benefits of decriminalization because there were still some of these holdover, forced medical treatment, compelled attendance at a doctor's office, other sort of administrative penalties for persons who use drugs that were backed by fines. So that is one potential solution. Is that, the comprehensive global solution? I think, unfortunately, the overdose epidemic is a complex problem. Decriminalization is going to be a big key component of solving some of those deaths, as is safe supply and, thorough regulation built off of a decriminalization. However, is it going to be the be all and end all and stop all drug deaths? Probably not, but I think it is going to be a significant impact in reducing this toll on human life. And we talk about deaths, but we also don't talk about the negative injuries, the cognitive injuries from, overdose and hypoxia to the brain and things like that, which is also devastating the system. And in terms of, just the sheer costs, I think it's something in the latest report out of a research institute at the University of Victoria in 2020, based on 2017 stats, said for criminal justice enforcement of drug penalties, it was $9.3 billion in Canada based on their estimates in 2017, if I've gotten the stats right. So it's this huge toll in terms of human life, but it's also a huge financial toll and drain on the state's resources to continue to enforce this prohibitive war on drugs regime that we continue to have in Canada, which, by the way, most experts will tell you was never based on any real genuine public health concern when it was first conceived of. It was based on racism 100 years ago and people's racist attitudes towards certain groups that did use particular substances and then using it as a way to punish that. And so it's a function of racism as well. That is a colonial vestige that we carry forward and continues to bear this awful disproportionate damage on disadvantaged and vulnerable groups like Indigenous folks, Black folks, and other persons of color who disproportionately are charged and convicted with simple drug possession charges.
Yeah, and along with women as well, women in the LGBTQ2 population, we're seeing that as well. And poor people predominantly are the ones that are criminalized. Right, but when you look at the statistics from Health Canada, as I have, the most harm in our society for many drugs, like alcohol and tobacco, and they're both regulated substances, right? And so it creates this dichotomy about what a good drug user is to a bad drug user, right? Because if you use drugs that are illegal, then that's bad. But smoking is legal, and I could go buy as many cigarettes I want. I can go to a liquor store and buy as much liquor as I want. It's my choice. I'm an adult to make that. And so by criminalizing people who use drugs, it takes away their autonomy as well. And so when we think about the life, liberty, and security of individuals and equality, right? Why is it that our society has taken such a stance, knowing that, if you see in the graph, opioids is this tiny of a line, and tobacco is way up here, and alcohol. And so when you think about that, it makes you really wonder, why is it that our society is okay with continuing to have these substances legal, regulated? And I don't think they should go away. There should be some different type of non-advertising and similar to what they do with cannabis. But it goes to show you that then it creates this dichotomy within the Canadian people of not understanding anything but seeing people who use other substances that are criminalized as criminals. And therefore impedes on their ability to access housing, employment, and healthcare, and many other issues as well. So I just wanted to mention that this is a very complex issue, and that has as long as time has existed. I mean, I don't know how much money you pour into something that has failed epically. It is, and we've done nothing to stop drugs from coming into our country. There's more poisonous drugs now that are killing people at alarming rates. There's more money gone into, criminalizing people that are poor. Like the most often targeted individuals and people of color, Black, African, Caribbean people, and of other color, and Indigenous people. And that is what our jails are filled with. They're not filled with the cartels or the mobs or whoever's, the organized crime entities. That's who should be in jail. The people that they're putting in jail are trying to survive. And so to me, that's abhorrent. Like, that is, in Canada, our country, a free country, I would think that we would entertain, if not seriously, take into consideration putting in regulation and legalization. I mean, it's benign to me that we would do this to people, and then when you look at the statistics of who's imprisoned and know that the war on drugs has failed. And let's be honest, it was never a war on drugs, because you can't imprison drugs and harm them in that way. It was a war on people who use drugs. And that's why our jail is filled with people who oftentimes have other issues, mental health, substance use, and then they release them back out onto the street with no access to help, housing, all of these things. And then they wonder why they return to substance using, because it's the only thing that makes them feel good at that time, because there's nothing in society set up to help them.
So I guess with, that in mind, so if we had a non-judgmental approach to substances where we looked at, cigarettes, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, whatever people decided to use, and we took this non-judgmental approach where it was legal, everything was legal, and we sort of just dealt with had a regulated supply for everybody, made things safe for everybody. That would reduce the billions of dollars being wasted in terms of punishing people, as well as create a more safer environment for people who are now dying because they have access to, terrible, adulterated, products. So I guess it's a non-judgment because I think that people have in their mind, someone who takes so-called drugs or cocaine, that's a bad person. They made bad choices. They deserve whatever happens to them. I think people don't realize that there are people taking substances who are making millions of dollars, that may be in Hollywood, and there are people who are taking substances who are poor. The problem is that when people who are poor take it on the street, they are the people who don't have the access to the financial resources to make sure what they're taking is clean. Whereas somebody making lots of money, they can take it safer, do it in the quiet, in their nice suburban home. The people who are poor are being additionally punished for being poor, for having in an abused home, particularly First Nations dealing with intergenerational, issues, the residential schools. So now they're trying to take substances to kind of, to try to have a sort of equanimity and balance in their life. Now they're being punished simply because they don't make all that money to control their safety of supply. So it's a non-judgmental approach to maybe educating Canadians that, we're talking about that they should, it's not about so-called drugs. We just need to appreciate that some people, use, cocaine, some people use cigarettes, alcohol is all equal, and let's get over this judgmental context, which is destroying lives. So I guess, is that an approach that we need to start looking at?
Most definitely. Yes, because people do need access to a regulated drug, but they also need it to be legalized. But decriminalization has to go along with that as well, because as we've seen with what happened with cannabis and the Cannabis Act, people are still criminalized within that act, right? Like, so there's really strict regulations around how many plants you can have, how much you can carry on your person. And so it was never decriminalized. It was just put into like a regulated, legalized model with strict regulations. I don't know if that makes sense, but so the facade was legalization, but in fact it wasn't full legalization because people are still criminalized. And so what happens with that is the people that were always criminalized previous, like disenfranchised Black individuals, Indigenous individuals, and other minorities and people of color are still the people that will still be targeted. Like in Nova Scotia, we have the highest per capita of carding of Black individuals in all of our country, little Nova Scotia. And so when you think about that, and you think about if we just, legalize substances or whatnot, and didn't have the decriminalized part with it, and have a very comprehensive approach to that, those individuals would still predominantly be targeted. And I don't know why that is, but it speaks to the racist nature of drug policy in itself. And it's so outdated. And there's been amendments put into it. But I mean, when you think back, 1908 is like when the Opium Act came in. And from then on, there's, been brief changes, but not a lot. And so, look at our jails. As I said earlier, it shows you how our drug policy is still entrenched in racism.
I just have a question. What do you think would it take for Canada to come together and solve this issue finally? What do you think would take? Is it more death tolls, or is it more people being aware?
Well, I think we need top-down leadership, setting an example. I mean, I think public opinion is swinging in a certain direction on this. In British Columbia, we've seen some reports of 60% of folks supporting decriminalization of simple possession. In other provinces, the stats I've seen, Ontario is nearing 50%. I think as this human crisis impacts more and more individuals, and I think if you ask most people, they could probably point out someone in their family or circle of friends that has had some issue with substance use, and also might have been impacted. I mean, I've been telling folks in talking about the action that part of the impetus for me deciding to take on this case was I had a family member who very nearly died of an overdose a little while back. And I think a lot of folks are like that, and they're starting to see, this substance use less as a moral issue and more as a health issue. It kind of ties back into Ray's earlier point about how we need to bring a non-judgmental approach. We need to have this further ideological shift amongst, the majority of Canadians, that people who use drugs aren't morally blameworthy. Their conduct, isn't a byproduct of their own misfortune or bad judgment. It's oftentimes that folks who start using substances have tremendous trauma early on in their lives, and they're using the substance as a way of self-medicating. We see all sorts of archetypes. We see other individuals who are injured in accidents and are prescribed opioids, and then the opioids are not appropriately titrated or weaned away, and then they're turning to the illegal supply to meet that need as well. And those are folks that circumstances intervened in their life, and they have started using substances. And I think most people, if you take the time to think about these aren't examples in which people should be blamed for their action. It should be recognized that substance use creates many health harms and is a health issue in many respects. And we have to follow public health evidence. And we have to follow the advice of public health experts who are speaking out and saying the best approach to deal with all of the negative consequences, both to individuals' health, but all the other social determinants of health that are affected. If you use substances and then are slapped with a criminal penalty, that creates an incredible stigma that is then perpetuated in society. And then you have barriers to housing, barriers to employment. You often can't travel to the United States. You face stigma from family and friends and other individuals. And that all compounds these pressures. And we need to target those until we get leadership saying the right things and supporting these policies that public health experts have called for, and then sending the signals for the rest of Canadians who aren't quite on side. And until we see other people coming on board by fully grappling with the complexity of drug use and some of the factors that lead into it, and the best approach to solving it as shown by public health experts. Without all of those things coming together, we're not going to see the necessary shift in order to affect policy change to stop this awful human crisis.
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to further that with this, that substance use or drug use in itself is not always a health issue, though. So I hesitate to go too public healthy or too health approach based on this, because there are many people that use substances just to enjoy themselves, much like people drink, right? Like if you go to dinner and you have a glass of wine, I say this to a lot of people in Health Canada when I've had conversations with them. I've said, imagine like if you walked into a safe, because I know bars and establishments are safe consumption sites. That's what they are. This has been going on for a long time. So that is a safe consumption place where people drink alcohol, have a good time with their friends, maybe share a drink. Oh, taste this, taste that, or, all these. But imagine being an individual who uses drugs and you walk into a highly medicalized place that is sterile. You have a stainless steel table that you have to go sit at, a limited time of like maybe 5-6 minutes max. And if you don't use your substance by then, they tell you you either have to muscle it or leave. And so that is not what I would call fun, right? Like, could you imagine going to a bar and being put in that position, right? But this is where drug policy has brought us. They've taken it from one spectrum all the way over into a medicalized model. And what I say is they have taken the culture that people who use drugs have created, they've boxed it up and they've spit it back out, and we don't even recognize it. So we don't even feel comfortable in those spaces because they're highly sterile and over medicalized. And so the further we get away from understanding drug culture and accepting it and making places and policies that uphold their human rights, but also places where they go that they can feel comfortable in a non-judgmental way and resembles somewhere they would feel comfortable not in a safe consumption site using. Because the further we get away from those nuances, the less people you have go to safe consumption or OPSs. And further to that, there's lots of evidence and research that's been done that people who use safe consumption sites and OPSs are within 500 meters, live within or congregate within 500 meters of the site. So what do we do about rural communities? What do we do about all these other? So it is a very limited, small scope issue. Again, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken box, right? Like you're just slapping all these Band-Aids on it, trying to fix it. So as long as we're going to stick with prohibition, harm reduction exists because of prohibition. You know what I mean? Because we've just taken such a stance on certain drugs being so bad or criminalized that now we're trying to make these little changes one by one, right? That serve a certain part of the demographic, but are never they're expensive, those sites. Very expensive to run, the staff that you need to have. And so it is impossible for us to believe that we can just give everybody in the lock zone, give everybody access to safe consumption and OPS, and think that that's actually going to stop deaths. No, we need to change the market and offer unregulated substances or offer regulated substances with education on those substances, right? Because right now, if they have on their campaign, I believe they're going to put lots of money into public education on opioid use, and I think several of the parties have that on. That will do nothing to destigmatize people who use drugs or face less discrimination in their lives because it's still a criminalized substance. And so the only way in which we can undo that is to ensure that people aren't criminalized, right? And change the narrative. Because how does one in society believe that it's okay, oh yeah, those substance users, it's okay. They're still criminals. People look at us as criminals because that's what the law says. Sorry,
so Ray, just to keep you up to speed, Ray, what we're talking about is I asked them a question. I asked them, what would it take for Canada to take action on this crisis? And Dustin shared it's going to be leadership and realizing that these people are not really inherently bad. They happen into it. It's like it's a coping mechanism. Maybe they had an accident. They had to do pain medications, but then they just happen into that. And then Natasha is saying that unless we normalize or give a space for the drug use to be a normal thing, destigmatize, it's never going to happen. Is that what you're saying? Did I get that right?
Yeah, and I'd also pretty well got that. But the only thing I'd say too is it's just not people don't use drugs just because they were prescribed or they were harmed or they faced trauma. People use drugs for the exact same reason people drink alcohol.
Exactly.
or smoke cannabis. They want to feel that disinhibition. They want to be talkative. They want to be social. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that. So, but where we see the most disproportionate impacts are on poor people and people of color, and they're the ones that are targeted, and Indigenous folks targeted for criminalization, and they're the ones that face the worst punity of the law.
So one of the things which I'm just wondering, we were talking about a whole idea of racism, is whether one step to try to move us away from this sort of mentality is to move away from this construct of drug this, drug that, and start talking about substances. Because as soon as I think, just like when, it's like calling a black person, and as soon as you hear them, you start thinking, oh, nigger, If we start talking about substances and sort of correct sort of this judgmental idea of drugs, because as soon as you think about drugs, people have an idea, oh, drugs, bad person, oh, does bad things, and we should stop that and correct that. It's kind of like, people who have a certain sexual orientation, or people have a certain, something's about them, we want to change their identity because they're doing something bad. So I'm just thinking that if we started sort of emphasizing, like all these sort of substances, and people just using substances and make it sort of a non-judgmental context, and rather than talking about drugs, if we could move away from that sort of lexicon, do you think that that would start to sort of get people, Canadians, to start rethinking about this whole context where we're putting this group as being a bad group that needs to be corrected, or we should ignore them because they're just losers? Is that one thing we could do to try to rectify this sort of this whole context that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think when you look back to when crack cocaine first hit the streets, it was depicted against Black people at that time. You know what I mean? It was an issue. This was the enemy of the streets, and they associate it with poor communities where Black people lived. And that's, you know what? Crack was everywhere. They just decided that they were just going to show it within one neighborhood and depict one ethnicity to blame it on, right? And that's wrong in drug policy, and that's been as long as our history goes on, like with the Opium Act of wanting to remove Asians out of our country, as well as marijuana was originally like a stigmatizing name because it was that's why they changed it to cannabis, because it was like a Spanish name that was depicted towards Mexicans and other Spanish individuals. And so there's been this long history of us depicting certain groups of individuals as being associated with these drugs. And so it's easier in your mind, or it's not mine, but in others' minds to associate a demographic with a criminalized drug. But, really, if we could move beyond that and really look at drug policy, and we want to do it in a holistic way that's going to meet the majority of Canadians, because predominantly we're not just talking about the disenfranchised, we're talking about all substance users here. So yeah, there needs to be a serious conversation. I would hope that no matter what government comes in, they will look at the task force reports and they will take action on those. There was bold recommendations made in there, and I commend those recommendations because I think there was a lot of good recommendations. But in my time in my career, what I've often learned is people do task force, they make reports, and then they go on a shelf and they collect dust, and nothing's ever really done with them. And I hope that's not. I hope that's not the case this time around. And Dustin, you can add to that if you'd like.
I agree with your point, Ray, about needing to think of it more as substance-based as opposed to drugs. Drugs could have a loaded term. You see in many different respects in life, people being critical and thinking critically about the language used and the historical negative connotations associated with certain slang words and swear words and other words, and even things that at first seem benign but aren't in terms of imagery. And I know within the persons who use drugs community, there's the push to refer to people as not drug users, because drug users is such a highly stigmatized word historically. But as persons who use drugs or persons with living experience with drugs, I think it's important for folks to just be cognizant of that in terms of what language is being used? Is that language perpetuating any existing stigmas that occur? Also, thinking about just this whole problematic concept of, racializing certain health phenomena or public health concepts. I mean, we saw this with COVID at the start, and Donald Trump and trying to attack folks with Asian descent based on that, dating back to the HIV/AIDS pandemic and it being seen as predominantly, and problem affecting gay men and LGBT folks. And I think that we have to recognize the disproportionate impacts of the criminal system on these folks, but we don't want to get caught in the trap of thinking it's a problem just for those folks too. We have to recognize that this is a problem that cuts across all areas of societies, all socioeconomic status. To speak to a point you spoke about earlier, that, it's only poor people that get the toxic supply, others who have higher echelons. There's lots of celebrities that have had drug overdoses in the past few years since fentanyl has occurred. This is a problem that every income strata, every demographic group, every religious group or cultural group in this country should be concerned about, because the overdose epidemic has touched folks that people love in all of those communities. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize the stigma that's faced by them, and that how sometimes the words that we use are really harmful, and how that is something that we as individuals, aside from speaking out to our politicians about the need for drug policy for reform, but how individually do we stigmatize persons who use drugs? And how can we change our language? How can we change our attitudes to correct that?
The fabulous points, Dustin. So one comment about the draft report. So when the draft report for the government was made, was it mostly academics and researchers? Was there people who were involved with these substances? Were they not involved in the whole process of building together the report? Who was involved in the composition of that report that wanted to advocate for decriminalization?
So if you go on Health Canada's site, there's a list of all of the co-chairs and all of the representatives that were on the task force. Yeah.
But in terms of the task force, the development of the report, how much time, do you know of any sort of amount of time they invested in actually consulting with the communities that were being most adversely affected by the substance abuse problem?
I can speak for myself and say that I was the only substance user on the task force. Somebody who actively used substances.
Okay, so
there was an inequity that existed in my mind's eye, and I don't believe I'm breaking my confidentiality right now, but so there, and I think item 7 of the recommendation says that they need to have broader consultation with people with lived and living experience of substance use. But in my opinion, that's after the fact, and I think that that's a missed opportunity. But that's something that they're going to have to, Health Canada will figure out on their own. I don't think there's any ill intent, and they like to engage many stakeholders, and that's great. But I think when we're talking about people who use drugs lives, people who use drugs should be prominent within these conversations. We shouldn't be the minority. We should actually hold equal, if not more, because those individuals, even if somebody is a trained psychiatrist or an addiction doctor, they still do not know. We're substance use experts. I'm a substance use expert because I use substances and I've faced impunitive drug laws. I've been imprisoned. I've had involvement with Children's Aid Society at one time when I was younger. And, all of these things that perpetuate and cause more harm onto families, split families up, and have mothers be put in jail and have their children ripped away from them on this outdated system that was developed, eons ago. I just don't understand how even though somebody has a medical degree or they have another degree, they may think they have an understanding of it, but they have never experienced it to actually know what happens. And so sometimes when I speak with people and I talk about my own story and I tell them things, they walk away like, oh, I never thought of that. And I would say no, because you've never experienced it. And so in fact, people admit it. And so for me, it's still this weird conundrum that we are the minority in many talks about drug policy. And my organization, Opiod, we've been fighting to be in all of these conversations, and we have. Health Canada has had us in lots of different areas. But it's in an advisory capacity, and so when you're in an advisory capacity, you're only advising. You're not actually making change. It's up to those individuals who hear you if they want to make the change, right? And so it's disappointing at times for myself, but I keep doing it because I often think people don't know what they don't know, and so somebody has to help people understand this. But it also is a burden on a lot of people to have to sit at these tables and constantly give their life over to people and then feel that they're not even getting any reciprocal, nothing in return to know where the policy, or if they're making a policy change, happen, right? So I would say across the board, whether it be the task force, whether it be any province, whether it be any city that's entertaining decriminalization, and seriously talking about that people who use drugs are main stakeholders in that and have equal representation within those talks.
Awesome. Yeah, so those are amazing points, Natasha. So, and Dustin, so you've been involved in a class action suit. So can you give us up to date in terms of what went on with that, and what was the nature of the class action suit against the government?
So I'll just clarify. It's not a class action filed under any province's Class Act proceedings. It's an action that's brought by Opiod as a representative plaintiff, along with 4 individuals. Okay. So it's separate. It's a class action has one representative plaintiff on behalf of potentially thousands. It's different from that, but I can describe the particulars of the suit. Yeah. It's a charter challenge based on Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly the Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security of the person, the Section 15 rights to equality, and the Section 12 rights to be free from cruel and unusual treatment and punishment. And Opiod and these 4 individuals are coming forward and telling their story, and also presenting social and legislative facts about, the structure of criminalization that exists, other steps of decriminalization that have occurred, and of ultimately putting forward the position that the actions of criminalizing are in effect causing this illegal supply to exist. If it were not for the criminalization, there would be a space in which a regulated supply could, be produced and then sold. And if that was the case, we would see far less deaths. And the fact that there is this threat to life, there's the threat to the health or the security of the person, there's an impact on the choices that they use in terms of self-medicating and their liberty and their security of the person. It impacts that Section 7 right. All the disproportionate effects of criminalization that are borne disproportionately on the basis of race, a protected ground, and ethnicity, because we see Indigenous, Black, persons of color disproportionately facing the negative consequences of criminalization for drug use. So that is violating the Section 15 rights. There's also just the fact that physical or mental disability is also a protected ground. So having laws that are specifically targeting folks that have, some form of substance dependence befouls that Section 15 right with respect to mental and physical disability as well. And then simply just having the potential threat of imprisonment or all the other negative interactions with the criminal justice system is a form of punishing folks who are morally, not blameworthy. There's a moral blameworthiness. And in that context, there's a gross disproportionality in terms of the punishment that's being doled out to folks versus what is the action they're actually doing, which Opiod and the individuals allege violates the Section 12 rights. That's kind of the Coles notes of the action.
And is that in a provincial court or federal court?
It is in the Superior Court in British Columbia, the BC Supreme Court. So the inherent jurisdiction court for British Columbia. And
what stage is that? Is that just is it being reviewed by the court, or what stage is that sort of litigation now?
So the action was just filed 2 weeks ago. So now it sits with the government we file it, we serve it to the government. Now it sits with them to give their formal response, and that will initiate further steps in the litigation with respect to, a reply from my clients, and then also, we'll enter a document and other discovery phase where we'll get more information from the government. We list the information we plan to use, and then eventually in the future, it will head to trial in the BC Supreme Court and then potentially be appealed even further. If other cases of this nature are any indication, it's the sort of case that may well go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. If folks are interested to learn more about the action, I really encourage them to go to drugdecrimcanada.com or follow the hashtag drugdecrimcanada on Twitter, on Instagram, because there's going to be information as the action develops on its status and various developments in terms of the government response and things like that, and when it's heading to trial. They can check out that website and they can learn more. The website has a lot of other information about Kapud, about the individual co-plaintiffs that are joining Kapud, and also with respect to, the why. And you can also, if you're one of the legal beagles like myself, you can go and read the claim.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so we'll definitely want to take all that website information when we publish the interview. We'll be want to publish those links. Do you envision potentially and wanting to invite witnesses from the community or interveners who might want to present their side in order to support your litigation process?
I suspect there will be many interveners in this matter. This is, of utmost public importance and in the public interest. We've already had discussions with folks who have indicated an interest. I'm not going to go into specifics, but have indicated an interest in intervening. Mm-hmm. If this proceeds by way of a conventional trial with oral testimony, each of representatives of Kapud and the individual co-plaintiffs will go before the court and tell their stories, and also speak to the harms that they've faced. There's likely to be expert witnesses as well coming forward, talking about some of the social science and medical evidence underpinning a lot of the claims. And then yes, interveners at various stages of the court proceedings can come forward and bring forward public interest arguments for or against what Kapud is arguing for.
And as far as witnesses and interveners, are those limited to British Columbia, or can they be coming from across Canada or internationally? Like for people who are watching this interview, who want to get engaged, who will have something to say to contribute to your efforts, what sort of geographic restrictions there may be for anybody who wants to support, to get involved, engaged as witnesses, interveners, or otherwise?
There's no technical geographic restriction. It's more difficult when it's first in the BC courts if you don't have some sort of connection to BC or link to counsel in BC to intervene. It's tricky, but folks all around the world can follow the story and provide input. Kapud is going to take various steps in terms of engaging with the public. There's a link on the website where folks can reach out to Kapud as well. Kapud has a GoFundMe page up. There's various things. I think that there's plans to have, Kapud routinely does a Stimulus Connect presentation. In several weeks' time, we're going to do a town hall type event to speak to members of the community. But it's not just limited to BC. And I should note that, though it is the BC courts initially making pronouncements, if it makes its way to the Supreme Court of Canada, because this is federal legislation, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that is specifically impugned, two sections of it are what are being challenged. And what we're trying to get is one section, the section on simple possession, struck out in its entirety, declared unconstitutional and struck out. And then the second section on trafficking read down, so certain elements of trafficking are not criminalized. That is a remedy that if it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada and they uphold any of those remedies being sought, it has effect across Canada. It doesn't just have effect in British Columbia.
Definitely, so it definitely has a lot of sort of legal ramifications in terms of the work that you're doing. And I guess it's going to be potentially a process that might take multiple years, because normally courts are quite slow in terms of, dealing with these type of issues.
And even slower post-COVID, there's been a tremendous access to justice crisis evolving as, COVID has placed limitations on several courts to quickly deliver justice. So it is something that is, in the normal times, would have taken several years, and it is still going to continue to take several years and possibly longer, which is unfortunate because, as was stated earlier, up to 17 people are dying daily from this crisis, and those death tolls will continue to rise and have in COVID. COVID has also had its impact in driving up the death rates. There was a slight dip in 2019 in terms of the deaths that were being experienced by persons who use drugs. And then because of several negative consequences in terms of border restrictions and SCSs shutting down, and then just the isolation caused by physical distancing, we've had this spike in increase. The supply is getting more toxic, and folks have died in unfortunately greater numbers post-COVID.
So how can, so you mentioned the GoFundMe page. So what are all the ways in which Canadians who support decriminalization, support moving us to an environment where we have where all Canadians have access to a safe supply of substances, and as well as a decriminalized context for the use of those substances, how can Canadians support the efforts of yourself, Dustin, and yourself, Natasha, the daily efforts outside the courtroom in terms of transforming Canadian policy in a direction which is going to start to immediately save lives and stop this course which does nothing to deal with the problem and just makes it worse. What are all the different ways?
There's several ways. Part of Kaput and the individual plaintiffs coming forward was the actual case and seeking redress from the courts, but part of it is the public awareness campaign that is centered around that action. And folks, as you mentioned, they can look on the drugdecrimcanada.com website, learn more. They can share information from that website. They can share information from Kaput and other individuals' social media accounts, amplify the message, educate themselves, amplify the message, speak to folks in power and policy decision makers about their wishes and desires with respect to drug policy. Provide financial support if folks are able to help Kaput, because this sort of litigation is something that is very costly. They're going up against, the federal government. They have an infinite war chest of resources in terms of they have the entire Canadian taxpayers' resources available to them. And it's basically just about spreading the message about the need for decriminalization leading to safe supply. In whatever channel they think that if they care about this issue, they can promote talking to friends. It could be as simple as just having a chat with some of your close friends who you don't know their position on drug policy and you're curious to know, and you want to talk about the impact that it's had on someone that you loved or yourself, and trying to alleviate that stigma on an individual level. Posting on social media, writing op-eds in the local paper. There's so many different ways that Canadians can add their voice to this conversation in support of drug decrim. And every little thing that you do helps. It's going to take an accreted effort from thousands of Canadians to help move this social policy, because like with, unlike other countries where we got to marijuana legalization, it was through legislation. It wasn't through being compelled by the courts. The courts did compel with respect to medical marijuana in some instances. But, that is the much simpler and more preferable way to see this positive reform happen in this country, is to just build public awareness and build pressure on folks who are in power and can make the necessary changes to stop this epidemic.
And one thought that came to mind are, we have, 3 jurisdictions in Canada. We have the municipal, the provincial, and federal. Should we, are we targeting all 3 jurisdictions, or are there one emphasis we should have more than another in terms of targeting public policy, and whether it's the federal government or the provincial government? And to what extent, if any, do municipalities have a role in terms of supporting a decriminalized context in terms of their local police forces, and how are the local police forces strictly have to adhere to the Canadian Criminal Code? So how does that?
It's a challenging question, because several police forces have said we do de facto decriminalization. We don't enforce these laws. Vancouver being one of them with respect to simple possession, but data reveals that there is still targeting, even if there isn't formal charges laid, people are still being targeted for use. Several municipalities also have been lobbied, Vancouver most notably, and has put forward a request for an exemption from criminal prosecution citywide for simple possession. So you can always lobby municipal politicians for changes there. But we have a complicated federation, and certain resources in terms of healthcare that need to be directed towards persons who use drugs in terms of safe supply also come from the provincial government. So folks can speak to provincial representatives and encourage them to provide more resources. But ultimately, in order to get a nice, clear signal across the board in Canada that drugs are decriminalized for simple possession, to alleviate the stigma, to allow folks to go and seek harm reduction, and to also ensure that there is a space for a regulated safe supply to be created. That falls on the federal government, who controls the levers of the criminal code, and in this case, the similar criminal legislation of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and also is typically the body that regulates food and drugs that fall outside of the criminal code. So they hold probably the largest bouquet of legislative powers and executive powers that could create a positive influence on this overdose epidemic, but they are by no means the sole level of government that can make a positive impact on this crisis. And folks should be approaching cities about writing letters of support, because the more major cities that have, several, Toronto, Vancouver, Victoria, Montreal, have all supported simple possession, decriminalization. Vancouver's gone a step further to actually call for Health Canada to give it an exemption. British Columbia is talking about doing the same. Toronto is also talking about doing the same. So it's this advocacy at the municipal level on multiple different fronts. It's advocacy at the provincial level, asking on them to call for decrim, asking on them to provide greater healthcare resources, asking for them to provide safe supply, because there are some examples where there is limited safe supply. British Columbia being probably the leading example in Canada. It's a start. It's by no means comprehensive enough to address the full scope of the problem. Provincial governments also need to step up with that, because there are going to be marginalized folks that cannot even rely on just a total free market that's regulated. Even if that was the case, there would be some public subsidization of drugs, like for other essential medications, might be required as well. So it's a complicated problem, and it's going to require a multi-pronged solution involving all layers of government in Canada.
So with that said, which is well said, Dustin, so my understanding is that even if all police forces across Canada decided they weren't going to arrest anybody, in terms of, say we're not going to arrest anybody and we're going to have an informal decriminalized context, we would still have a terrible problem, because Canadians don't have access to a safe supply. So we just simply wouldn't be arresting anybody, but then they would still have all this adulterated supply of, which is causing all these terrible overdose. So my question, though, with respect to the legal process is that, I haven't really, done a little background on this, but since you mentioned that the issue of a safe supply is a federal jurisdiction, does that mean that the federal court of Canada would have some, be a potential avenue for a sort of litigation in terms of the federal government's role? And since people are dying, since you can document that there are deaths being caused, is there any opportunity? Again, I'm not the lawyer here. I have a legal background, but I'm not the lawyer. But is there any opportunity for injunctive relief for people who are dying if if somebody presents in a federal court that people are dying, we need injunctive relief to stop this. This is the basis for injunctive relief. Like, is there any recourse for the federal court to get involved in an injunctive relief and documented circumstances that it could save lives?
Well, first off, the federal court has a very particular and limited jurisdiction over certain federal enactments. And in certain contexts, the federal court might be the venue, typically with respect to CDSA, Controlled Drugs and Substance Act charges, that falls on the provincial jurisdiction, because inherent courts in the provinces have wide-ranging powers with respect to federal laws as well. So that is, in Capude's view and the individual's view, is the most appropriate venue for the particular action that they're seeking. However, I'm not going to say that, a separate action brought by someone in the federal court going after certain inadequacies in another federal law or regulation isn't a possibility. Is injunctive relief possible? You could get injunctive relief from the British Columbia courts. It's something that's actively being considered. Injunctive relief is very hard to get. It's a difficult threshold because oftentimes you have to present nearly your full case in advance, and the court has its own particular test, based on if you have a prima facie case, if there's the potential for irreparable harm, and where does the balance of convenience lie between the parties. And oftentimes in showing those various forms, it expends a lot of effort, and sometimes the injunction doesn't go your way, and it can almost be like you've exhausted several years effort trying to just get the injunction when you could have proceeded in the normal course through the action. It's something that folks are actively considering, but I can't comment or speculate as to whether my clients will at any point in the future apply for injunctive relief, but it is an avenue that remains open.
Awesome. So do you have any, Natasha?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this has often come up in many circles that we've talked about decriminalization or alternatives too. And so there's an issue when we want to say decriminalization has strings attached, right? Because if we're asking for there to be a wide access within a decriminalization model to safe supply, the system is not set up right now, the health system, to be able to handle that. And I think we've seen that very plainly in BC, that a lot of doctors just don't want to do it. There's the few, gung-ho people that'll do it, and that's across every province. So if we look in a decriminalization model and we start making suggestions to go looking at different health interventions, I think it stifles the conversation of decriminalization. I believe safe supply is full well needed. Do I believe that all doctors, just because we decriminalize and we ask for a safe supply, are going to do that? Absolutely not. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And further, the health minister had previously given out an exemption for, a change in regulations when COVID-19 first hit and we went into lockdown, about prescriptions and how they could change up their prescription prescribing. It could be done through fax and all these different various ways without prescription monitoring, being a prime component. It was just to make sure that people had access to what they needed. Along with the mitigation guidelines that the BCCSU wrote, doctors rebelled against that. They didn't feel, that they were adequately notified by this or had time, nor did they feel comfortable. And so, so when I think when we talk about decrim, I fully believe we need safe supply. I fully believe we need regulation and legalization. But I think if we talk about safe supply in the realm of decriminalization, all of these little places that are asking for decriminalization, I think they have to call for these things. Because the opposite of criminalization is not criminalizing somebody. And so when you think about that, there doesn't need to be an alternative to, because that is the alternative. Strike up another committee, and then let's start talking about the health system. And then after we have decriminalization and there's funds, hopefully divert it back into community, because they won't be using it to pick up people with, petty crimes or or simple possession and, things like that. There's dollars saved there. And I would hope that those funds could be diverted back into, community to help have a community response, help fix those things on that end. And so I always get a little bit worried the more that we talk about all of these things that we need to point to that need to go with decriminalization, because just in plain terms, the opposite of criminalizing someone is not.
So my understanding, based upon what we've talked so far, is there's basically two main arguments for sort of the safe supply and decriminalization. Is not only does it save human lives, but it saves, we'll say, billions of dollars, because I think people think that, we're going to stop those drug users, we're going to be wasting money and it's just going to cost us more. People are not thinking about how much money is being wasted on needless persecution and prosecution. So I guess we'd be saving money, not only by having this decriminalized context, by having the safe supply, billions of dollars that can go into sort of treatment, education, other areas of the health sector, social justice, affordable housing. So that would be freeing up resources that is being completely wasted in the litigation process. But one question I have, though, is that in terms of a model of safe supply, is what, for example, is going on with cannabis, where we have sort of stores where people can buy regulated cannabis. Should we have those stores for people whose substance might be LSD or cocaine or whatever it might be? Would those types of similar stores provide a basis on a model of having that safe supply? Would that be a sort of a model, or are you thinking of a different approach to safe supply?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing up like the cost of criminalization, because here's what I think most Canadians don't know. They don't know how much money is actually spent on criminalizing people, across the board. I mean, and you think about the amount of cost to imprison one person, it's like around $150,000 per year or something. And it can be upwards if you're in a federal prison. So when you think about that, and all they're there is for simple possession, I mean, that money could be better used for that individual within the community. You know, people can't get access to treatment. They can't get access to safe supply, but yet we'll put them in jail for a year and we'll pay, over $100,000 to have them in prison. So it is an astronomical cost to taxpayers. And I personally believe that it is fiscally irresponsible of any government to continue with prohibition. Because we're, after all these years, nothing has changed, and we're still spending, more money after bad money after bad money after bad money, and not seeing any return on that money. Further to that, when you're talking about safe supply, I think that there needs to be a regulated model, and not only a regulated model, a medicalized model, because there will always be the need for people that do have substance use issues that need to go on to opioid agonist treatment, or they may need to go on to safe supply program, so that it moderates their use that for those individuals. But for the broader Canadians in this country that use substances that don't classify there, what about those individuals? They're still at harm. They're still at risk of encountering a poisonous substances and dying, or maybe even getting criminalized, and then that will change the trajectory of their lives. So I think it doesn't have to swing. I don't want the pendulum to swing from total prohibition over to capitalism, right? There has to be some meeting in the middle. And what I mean by that is when you look at cannabis, it went right into government models. Very few provinces and territories have like mom and pop shops that can actually sell cannabis, And so here we had people who use drugs selling cannabis to people, giving them a safe supply of cannabis for many years, and they're sitting in jail. And now they have no access to be able to. They were the professionals that were doing that when the government, was too cowardly to legalize. And so during the time that they were like, no, they've actually taken the people that they've already criminalized and disenfranchised, marginalized, and pressed further, and now cut them out of the field that they worked at when they were the experts working in that field. And I would say that that's the same with safe supply right now. We have groups like DULF that are going out and they're buying drugs off of the street. They're bringing them in, they're getting them all tested, and they label the packages with exactly what's in it, with warning labels and to inform people. And then they do information sessions with people prior to giving these back out to the street for no profit whatsoever, for free. And those individuals have a marked box of exact contents of what's in that and gives them out. And so when you think about that, if we move way over to the opposite end again, and we're going to go back into a capitalist model of government, LSCs and like liquor store commissions here in Nova Scotia sell our cannabis. So it's in a very strictly regulated model where it's government tax and it's that, and it leaves a whole majority of people who use drugs that have been doing this to help other people who use drugs, not able to access that market, not able to make it a livelihood out of it, and be vindicated for something that they were doing that was actually helping the community, instead of being continuously discriminated against because they did it when the government didn't feel it was legal.
So the decriminalizing context is creating an environment where certain corporate interests are exploiting people's use of substances and is not providing a sort of a community economic model, which would be probably come from full legalization, where you're taking it away, you're taking the control of that substance away from just a corporate private exploitation into the community, where it's you just simply assure the safety of product, but you're not limiting the sort of the financial gain, so to speak, to the corporations, which are taking that money outside of the community into corporate control.
Exactly. You said it better than I did. But that's exactly what I meant. It's oftentimes we exclude people that provided a service that nobody else would provide, and then we cut them out of that service.
So the people who could participate in the cannabis economy, they're being excluded simply because they fall out of a government mandate of certain corporations which might have had sweetheart deals with the government to have access to selling cannabis, cutting people out. So they're still jobless. They could be having a job selling cannabis and earning a living, but now they're cut out, and maybe they might have to turn to other substances because now they're completely cut out of the cannabis economy where people think, oh, it's good now, but now they're just cut out. So decriminalization is basically a hypocritical context where certain corporations get the profit, but you're taking it away from the community that could benefit from the context, and you're still putting people in the criminal penalty boxes if they're selling it outside of that sort of strict regulated model.
Yeah, and I don't think it would actually happen in a decriminalization model necessarily. We would have to look at a regulation model similar to what they did with cannabis, right? Because my hope is with decrim, we could start looking at those other models and seriously take the task force recommendations that were presented to Health Canada of how Canada wants to move forward. Because just being decriminalized doesn't mean that you're going to have access to produce or sell substances that are still deemed currently illegal. Only the individual is decriminalized. But I think moving forward, when we look at the long-term scope of decriminalization, regulation, and legalization, that yes, we need to be able to empower the communities that have already been harmed by all these policies, and then they overturn it per se. If they were to overturn and move into a regulated model, legalization model, that they should seriously take into consideration that the experts that were already providing this service should be the experts that can continue providing that service within a legalized context and be able to have their own, make a livelihood and make income out of what they were doing when the government would not do it.
So we need to have inclusion at all levels, inclusion from people who use substance in the formulation of policy at all levels, including any amendments needed to the draft task force report, and inclusion in the conception of the benefits and returns and use associated with the economic development of those substances in order to ensure that the community is benefiting from the shift in policy and not just corporations which are excluding and continuing to marginalize people who want to be part of a more inclusive economy. So is that
Correct.
a fair?
Correct.
And that would be good on all fronts, in that, it would likely create a greater buy-in for the safe regulated supply, because we have the situation existing with cannabis now where we still have, to some extent, two markets, right? We have the legalized market and the illegal market, and some people, for whatever reasons, price point or their dissatisfaction with the corporatization of certain elements of the new legal marijuana market, are still using from that illegal market. And the ideal situation, and this isn't a particular remedy that Kaput or the individual plaintiffs are seeking, this will be up to government to decide and design through adequate consultation what is the best model to follow decriminalization. But we're seeking that decriminalization happen, and then it's likely that if that was to be the case, a court would give some period of time to government to adequately respond. They wouldn't just let the switch, turn right away for fear of consequences. Typically with these sort of cases, there's a year, 2 years that's given where the declaration is suspended and government has an opportunity to come up with some system. And in coming up with that system, they would ideally craft a system where they've listened to persons with lived experience using drugs and created an ideal market that maximizes the number of folks coming into the safe supply and avoiding the toxic illegal market. Because if the way in which this is rolled out is something that doesn't include community and is perhaps unnecessarily too corporate, we might see a similar situation where there's a large market share retained in the legal market. And the goal here is ultimately get rid of the cost of criminal justice enforcement. That's one part of the cost equation. The second part of the cost equation is reducing the cost of human lives, both in terms of the human toll, which is tremendous and on its own should be a reason for evoking policy. But the reality is the hospital expenses, the paramedic and emergency service expenses with the overdose, ideally those would go down as people move to the safe supply and ensure that there's safe supply of drugs. And then, as has also been said with marijuana, one of the particular goals is to divert resources that are flowing to the procurers in the illegal market, the cartels, as Natasha had said, and these organized crime elements that are profiting off of the existence of the illegal market. So there's a variety of different cost consequences that ideally a combination of decriminalization and an effective and responsive and equitable legalized and regulated system coming through in its wake could ideally pass on all of these benefits.
Have you any comments to add, Natasha?
No, I think Dustin said that well. I would like to add that as a person who uses drugs, and I have loved ones that have, I have lost so many people over the last several years that it is such I can't even explain to you the climate that we work in. We have people that are responding to over 100 overdoses a day, like working in overdose prevention sites and safe consumption sites. Like, we are first responders to this, but these are also people we love and care about, and we're watching them just drop, gone. Just like, today, hi. So I have to wonder every time a client walks into my office, is this the last time I'm going to see them? And so if you can think about that every time you see somebody that you care about or you work with, you hope you said everything you can say before they've left your presence, because you just know that you might not see them tomorrow. And so for me, if that alone doesn't push governments, and maybe it's because it's so far beyond their comprehension to know what that's like, but we are living in a state of trauma and devastation on a daily basis, watching people we love die. And so, our communities have been decimated, and their names now, like when we do Overdose Awareness Day, there's so many names, we can't even name everybody anymore, who we love and lost, because we're just losing so many people. So I would say, if anybody takes anything out of this interview, is that I would hope that they would see this in a different light, because it shouldn't just have to happen to you for you to understand that people are people, no matter if they drink alcohol or they smoke cigarettes or if they use other substances, right? We're still people. And those people have families that love them, just like I love them. And living like this constant trauma over and over and over again is now burning out the frontline workers and people that work with people who use drugs. And there's no recourse for those individuals to have extended time off or, extra health benefits to even deal with any of these issues, because predominantly our sector, unless we've created our own employment like we have here at the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, we've had breaking into the employment sector has been really hard. And so we get minimal paid jobs in other areas, and it's mostly frontline workers, right? And they experience such trauma and harm responding to those many overdoses all day, or just going into work and finding out somebody you just saw the day before had passed. So I just hope that people take away from this that it doesn't matter who you are. It can happen to somebody you know. It's not a certain demographic of individuals. And please don't allow it to happen to yourself or to someone you love prior to at least entertaining this conversation to change the narrative of drug policy in our country.
So definitely well said, Natasha. So it's like a feedback snowballing where people are experiencing this human tragedy around them, which is pushing them more into taking potentially dangerous substances because of the poor regulation of the supply, which is, and then when they potentially perish or die as a result of those, the access to the poor quality supply, it just creates a whole continuing growing malaise and destructiveness in the community, and the failure of policy, of resolve to deal with the sort of the legal aspects, as well as the poor quality of supply, which is the result of this issue, is causing a continuing spiraling problem. Just sort of And I saw that because of COVID, and we've been cut off from the United States pretty much from the pandemic, is actually making this supply even worse toxic.
Yes, it is. That's a very true statement. We've seen like a lot of substances in previous were adulterated with carfentanil or fentanyl, which is bad in itself. But now we have it's being adulterated with benzodiazepines, not pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. So they're like, a lot stronger than those. And so people are buying something, they don't know what's in it. And so what's happening across the country now, people are overdosing and they're Narcaning them, giving them naloxone over and over and over again, and they're not coming out of it. And it's because of this non-regulated analog of a benzodiazepine that's in there. And so people don't know that they're taking it. And then there's other instances as well, not even just in the overdose aspect or overdose death aspect, is that, we recently had done some interviews with our clients, and I'll vividly remember, it's like, I didn't consent to taking benzodiazepines, because they had no idea what was in it. And so there is no consent from the individual that's ingesting that substance to even know that. And then so what happens is they end up getting a dependence or tolerance to that. And so if they do stop using the say it was heroin or whatever drug they were using, then they also have to face the reality of, they're gone into a safe supply program, I hope hypothetically, and it's not working. It's because they're in benzodiazepine withdrawal as well, unknowingly, right? So, and I think when you think in that context, like that people want to take a certain substance, but they didn't consent to take what was in that. And so that's what I mean by the autonomy. Our autonomy has been removed, and it puts us at further harm.
Awesome. So that was very well said. So before we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to comment on, Natasha or Dustin, that you didn't get a chance to mention?
I think, Dustin mentioned our site. I think we're going to need, as much public support as we can get. And I put our drugdecrim.com there in the chat, and we have a GoFundMe page there because obviously we're going to need lots of funds for litigation. But further that, I would like to close with, sort of a moment of silence, I guess, to commemorate to all the lives that have been lost to this. As somebody who uses drugs and has many people and friends and family that have died around me, that I'd just like to respect their lives for one brief moment, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, I think that. Thank you very much for that. I mean, we as we go through our day in our busy lives, it's very important for us to definitely reflect on all the lives that has been tragically lost, and to take a moment to think about how we can move forward so that their loss of lives are not in vain, so that we can helpfully save lives, not only Canadians, but other people, through the leadership that we can provide in our communities and across Canada in inspiring the type of change which yourself, Natasha, and yourself, Dustin, are leading. So we commend both of you for inspiring us today to move forward. And we hope that we wish you all well in terms of your efforts. We hope to potentially reconnect with you anytime there are new developments, because we are here to support and serve Canadians as a media organization here at Toronto Business Journal, and we look forward to putting up those links below our interview, so that we can start hopefully inspiring other Canadians and other people around the world who have seen this, who are inspired to not take the action that needs to be done to save more lives. So thank you very much again, Natasha. Thank you very much, Dustin. Thank you very much, Ruth from Toronto Business Journal, for being here today. So thank you everyone for watching our extremely informative and inspiring interview on the opioid crisis. And we look forward to any of our viewers who might want to push comments below. And please click on the link so that we can, because Dustin and Natasha and all the work that they're doing deserves your support, so that we can save more lives and not have the lives of Canadians who have lost their lives to go in vain. So thank you very much for being with Toronto Business Journal today, to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for having us.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I guess we'll do the editing afterwards, and again, I'll check those links below the chat room as well. But please feel free to, you can email me directly anything which you might have forgot there. But I'll definitely check after the interview. Let me see what's there right now. Let me see, make sure I have